Yes, in case you hadn't noticed, I'm playing Sheila today. And I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Nancy Dickson. Nancy was born in Washington, D.C., but she's lived in many places in the world, including Paris, London, and Athens. She's worked as a translator, secretary, union organizer, political activist, model, editor, writer, among other things. She settled into an upper elementary administration for a while and then spent enough time at the University of Maryland to receive a PhD and became a professor. We're fortunate that she's giving us this series of presentations on the legend of King Arthur. We've learned that the legend has been influenced by pre-Christian Celtic folklore and has been interpreted to be loosely based upon or modeled upon the life of Jesus. The legend has been retold and reinterpreted in various forms of literature, including poems, novels, films, and has become one of the most pervasive legends of all time. Overall, the King Arthur legends have become an integral part of Western literature and continue to be retold and reinterpreted in various forms, making it a classic example of an epic. Please help me welcome Dr. Dickson and to tell us more about the King Arthur legend.
Welcome back. Is this a good volume? Great. 2 housekeeping details before we get started. First, I'm really sorry for the ads in last Saturday's movie. I was sick. I had nothing to do with it, but I still am sorry you all were subjected to it. And I have been promised that future movies will be checked and have no ads. The other thing is that I thought some of you might like to have an email connection to the thousands, well, not thousands, the places online where you can read these stories that I'm having to condense. So if there's any interest, even one person, I will compile the list and ask Pam to send it out. I'm seeing some nods, so I will do that. And then once I've sent the list out, if there's a particular character or a particular story that you're interested in, let me know, because between Project Gutenberg and all of the universities, these stories are accessible to everyone for free. And who doesn't like free? So today we are at the halfway point in this lecture series. Today's class included. There are 3 more lectures in front of us and 3 behind us. But we are not at the halfway point in the number of stories. For 600 years, oh, come on. Okay. For 600 years, we have 5 surviving manuscripts that mention Arthur. 5. That's less than 100 years. Okay. But after William the Conqueror, we have 6 major writers writing multiple stories about Arthur just in the territory held by Eleanor of Aquitaine, which is the orange and the pink on the map. And that's a lovely picture of Eleanor going off to the Crusades with her husband and her parrot. So we've got this monster burgeoning of stories. And I went through some of the reasons for that last week. But I'd like to move to something more modern for a minute. Some of you may remember the asymptotic curve from high school. That's when you start with one thing and then add another couple, and then those multiply out. We find them charting population growth. Over time. This is inventions over time, because you have one invention and that leads somebody to say, oh, but what about this and this? So the inventions go up, but you hit a point where the witch shows us you can't go any farther beyond that. The inventions can keep going up, but the population is hits a point of non-sustainability. Now, I can see some confused faces. What does all this have to do with Arthur? Well, his stories follow the same sort of curve. In the beginning, there was just a simple mention of a war chief who was an example of all that was best in a warrior. Here's the war chief. Over the years, the stories grew, but as you saw from the second slide, they didn't grow rapidly. There might have been a bard who heard a particularly nice piece of a story, a bit of magic or challenge, or a monster. And like the axe handle that somebody thought to put on the stone axe, they added bits and pieces to the legends of Arthur. This was all done by a particular storyteller in a particular time who wasn't quite as interested in Arthur as he was in how to put these stories together so that they came up in an interesting fashion. But Arthur is still the linchpin. Arthur was also useful to the clerics, the churchmen, who were writing histories of their country, who needed a brave hero to take on the role of king. Now, as we've talked about, we don't have a lot of information about the early Arthur. If you remember the class a few weeks ago when we talked about all the things we thought we knew were part of that early story, and it boiled down to only 3 that were actually part of Arthur before William. But that all changes following William the Conqueror. We looked at 5 reasons why the stories changed so dramatically. William brought peace to the islands and the northern part of France. Women began to take on roles of power in the political arena, so stories were either written by or for women, and women went from being the powerless hostages of fortune that they had been in the earlier tales, and now were actors right on a par with, or sometimes more powerful than men. We saw this last week in the story of Lanval, where the mysterious lady has almost complete power over Gawain. There's the mysterious lady in her tent, and one possibly mysterious lady telling one of her younger cohorts, this is how you handle men. Things haven't changed all that much. As the land of Britain and France were brought together under Eleanor and Henry, new tales were brought in, especially from Brittany, which is the section of France closest to Britain. It's in the northwest corner. Celts had migrated to this area when the British Isles were under attack and manuscripts were being burned, bards were being killed. But in the peaceful backwaters of Brittany, the Celtic stories had continued to be told over centuries. Most of the bits that we now see as part of the Arthurian legend follow the steep rise of the curve and continue to expand like technology. Little fear of attack, rising wealthy leisure class, more educated people, all of this meant more time for stories. and a demand for something new and interesting and exciting. Furthermore, if you can imagine the curve in 3 dimensions, we not only have more stories, but we have more stories in more different genre. A modern equivalent to this sudden explosion of stories can be found in the modern mystery story genre. After the first mystery story, Murders in the Rue Morgue, written by Edgar Allan Poe in 1841, not only were more and more detective stories written, but in the past almost 200 years, we've seen them expand into multiple categories: historical detective fiction, noir, cozy mysteries, true crime. And in less than 200 years, the mystery story has grown into one of the largest categories of literature today. The same sort of thing happened with Arthur after William. There were stories founded in Celtic myth, stories of Arthur passing as historical, poetry, prose. In all of this, we still find Arthur as part of action tales, but now the fighting is more often done by one of Arthur's knights than by the king himself. Fighting is also formalized into jousting. And the Grail quests add a whole religious element to the quest. These Arthurian stories have gone from telling of a monodimensional war chief to the king who assembles brave knights to fight, not as an army against an external enemy. William put an end to all that, but to fight evil, much like the heroes of our childhood. Now I can almost hear you argue, Spider-Man, the Phantom, they were all solitary heroes. But following the Norman invasions and the acquisition of the Round Table, Arthur and his legendary court became full of solitary heroes. Gawain did not take a small army with him to go after the Green Knight. I love this. It's a tapestry of, you can see, obviously the Green Knight on the left and Gawain being watched by women with piles of green hair. I don't know whose imagination this was, but Gawain didn't even take a squire with him when he went off to find the Green Knight. And when small groups of Arthur's men rode off on the Grail quest, they are not fighting evil. Quite the contrary, they're trying to acquire something holy and good. In fact, we can see the change in society and the social mores reflected in the stories of Arthur as they change over the centuries. Now, we talked last week about Marie de France, one of the first named women authors of medieval Europe. In her stories and those of other female writers of her day, we can see the very earliest beginnings of feminism. Pictures of Marie writing. Marie's women aren't trying to get this so you can hear me and I can also see my notes, which is really useful. Aren't always the victims of male aggression. Sometimes these women are the aggressors or participants in a plot, as we saw in Gawain and the Green Knight. Morgane, who in other stories is Arthur's sister. She was a major behind-the-scenes actor in that story. But all of this still leads to the $64,000 question. Why did Arthur survive? Why did his stories continue to be told, shaped, and reshaped for new audiences? We don't see this with other hero stories. Aeneas is always back in ancient Troy. Beowulf, hero of the Geats, stays firmly rooted in 5th century Scandinavia. Arthur, like many other heroes, came into existence during a time of turmoil and conflict, a war leader, and he continued in that role for 4 or 5 centuries while his country was in one set of battles after another, fighting off one set of invaders and then another. But then, my favorite guy, William the Conqueror, came along, and except for the northern borders of England, up in Scotland, land of the Picts, land from Spain all the way up to Scotland was in peace for the first time in centuries. You've got from the can do it. Nope. There we go. From this pink down here going into Spain, all the way up. And you notice this is a very familiar shape. Anybody remember what that shape is? It's the land that the Romans held. The Welsh, the Irish, and the Scots managed to hold out against just about everybody. So this whole territory, it's a huge swath of Europe, was in peace for the first time in centuries. And I want you to notice, oops, nope. Never mind. Most of you know where Brittany is, right? Uh-oh, now I've done it. Brittany. This little bit up here. That was settled by Celts when the Romans first came and invaded Brittany, and I'll be talking about that later. But this territory was at peace. There was no more need for a warlord. Other heroes did not outlive their function. Beowulf killed monsters and dragons. That's what he did. The one tale we have of him tells of battles and feuds that happened years before he was born, and battles and feuds that will come after he died. But Beowulf does not survive. Roland and Charlemagne in France were historic figures, battle leaders, warriors, but stories of them did not continue to grow and change after their deaths. So we are left with them frozen like insects in amber, forever fighting at the pass at Roncevaux. The wonderful Celtic hero, warrior, Cuchulainn, died a heroic death because he tied himself to a pillar so he would not die lying down. But he still didn't survive. So we're back to the question, why Arthur? What is it about him that allowed him to continue to morph and change over a millennium and a half? I mean, think about that. That's a long time. Recently, I've spent many enjoyable but fruitless hours chewing on this conundrum. Why Arthur? I think in part because he was in the right place at the right time. Not only did he emerge as a warrior hero when warrior heroes were needed, but when powerful kings were needed for demanding loyalty from unruly knights, there he was. And later, when the stories needed to be broadened and expanded, open to women, but all somehow connected, There was Arthur, the king who sat in his castle, as we saw in Gawain and the Green Knight and in Landville, while his knights rode off to do battle against evil and rescue damsels in distress. Furthermore, during times of peace, there is time for seduction and adultery. And the story you'll hear in a few minutes reflects this. The change from the king as war leader to the king as someone who sits back and directs traffic, protected by his knights, and tries desperately to ignore his queen's infidelity. This is the one that's come down to us today, and the one we see in virtually all the Arthurian material following 1066, and really up until today. But it does take a big stop right when the Death of Arthur, the peculiarly named book, which is the first attempt to bring all the Arthurian stories and legends into one compendium, was the second book ever printed in England. The Bible, of course, came first. The author, Mallory, compiled, rearranged, interpreted, and modified material from various French and English sources. Then, after Mallory, there was very little interest in Arthur. He sort of went into abeyance, and we'll talk more about that next week. But he was revived again in the 19th century. The first printing of Mallory's book was made by Caxton 15 years after it was completed. Now, only 2 copies of this original printing survive, but it proved to be so popular, it was reprinted with illustrations, and then again a little later, and then 3 more editions were published within the space of about 100 years. Each of these contained changes and errors. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here. Last week, we heard Landville, the story by Marie de France. Oh, this is a piece of the manuscript that goes with Caxton's book. And these are imaginations of what Marie de France might have looked like, because nobody knows exactly who she was. The only way she's got that name is that in some of her manuscripts, she says that it was written by Marie from France. And Marie is a very popular name in France, so there must have been a lot of them. Landville is a knight of Arthur's court who is overlooked by the king, wooed by a fairy lady to whom he promises not to reveal her identity, but he breaks his promise when Guinevere accuses him of having, quote, no desire for women. Now, that was a bad thing to be accused of back then, and in many places, it's still a bad thing to be accused of today. In front of Arthur, Guinevere accuses Landville of shaming her, and Arthur, in an extended scene, demands that he reveal his mistress. Despite the broken promise, his fairy lover eventually appears to justify Landville's boast and take him away with her. The tale was so popular, it was translated into many different languages. Today, we're going to look at a story by one of the other super popular authors of Arthurian tales in the 12th century. Some of these are really tongue twisters. Chrétien de Troyes, who was also from France, who wrote a story called Lancelot or the Knight of the Cart. Doesn't work. It's one of the first stories to feature Lancelot as a prominent character, and one in which Kay, surprisingly enough, who was one of the first of Arthur's knights, mentioned way back before William, has been demoted to seneschal, which is about the equivalent to being a butler in an upper-class British household. You will notice he eats not with Arthur and the others, but with folks who have served the meal. In this story I'd like to tell you today, Chrétien has drawn in many elements. Guinevere is the damsel who needs to be rescued after Arthur foolishly hands her over to a bad guy. Now, you've probably begun to notice that Arthur is no longer the stand-up guy who doesn't make mistakes of the earlier stories, but he does stupid things, loses his temper. There's physical fighting in this story between good guys and bad guys. There's scheming women, magic, a malicious dwarf, horrific obstacles. But above all, there's a happy ending, so you don't need to worry. It all comes out right in the end, which is true virtually of all the Arthurian material following William. The Knight of the Cart is one of my favorites because it has so many of the Arthurian elements with new elements from elsewhere. It has, as I said, evil dwarfs, independent women. They own their own castle, their own tower. They live alone with their own loyal servants. They're sexually independent. They're wealthy, reflecting women of independent means like Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now, were I to tell you the entire story, we'd still be here when the bar opens. So I'm going to compress it a little bit. I'm going to start by giving you a mostly unexpurgated version of what Chrétien wrote, just so you get a flavor for his language, even though it's in translation. And then I'm going to squunch the rest of it together. Chrétien de Troyes is the first writer who consciously used the myth of Arthur as the basis for fictional narrative. Lancelot, like most of his works, has its roots in the British Isles and seems particularly related to Celtic abduction tales in which a mysterious stranger claims a married woman, carries her off through magic or by force, and takes her to his otherworldly home. In these tales, the husband pursues her, and after overcoming seemingly impossible odds, penetrates the mysterious kingdom and rescues his wife. Chrétien acknowledges that he received both the material, that is the gist of the story, and how she wanted it treated from Marie de France, I'm sorry, I got the wrong name here, from Eleanor of Aquitaine. And this, when he says this, it shows that he was conscious of creating a literary production. Here's the story. I want you to tell me, I want you to write a story about Goldilocks and the Three Bears, but I want you to set it up in medieval time, for example. The various adventures are all related to the expiation of Lancelot's great sin against the courtly conduct code, his two-step hesitation before mounting into the cart of infamy. Each of the adventures in this story demands that he serve women unhesitatingly for having shown the slightest preference for knightly honor over amorous duty. Now, the story starts on Ascension Day. Arthur had come from Caerleon and was holding court at Camelot. After the feast, everyone lingered in the hall. The queen was there along with all her ladies. Kay, who had furnished the meal, was eating with the others who had served the food. So he's not got a high position in the court. They were still sitting at table when a fully armed knight came riding in and gave no greeting to the king. Remember that from Gawain and the Green Knight? The guy just comes riding right into the hall and says, "King Arthur, I hold captured knights, ladies, and damsels who belong to your kingdom. I have no intention of returning them to you, no matter how hard you try. You'll never be able to get them back." The king, Arthur, shrugged and said, "Well, we just have to endure what we have not the power to change." Now, this doesn't sound like the Arthur we've come to know over the past 3 weeks. That Arthur would have grabbed up his sword, and anyway, we know what he would have done. But this story takes place in a kinder, gentler time. Arthur's changed, but he's still full of grief. Then, just as the knight's getting ready to leave, he turns around and says, "King, if in thy court there is a single knight in whom thou hast such confidence that thou would dare to trust him with the queen, that he might escort her after me out into the woods where I'm going, I promise to wait there and will surrender to you all the prisoners held in my country if he is able to rescue the queen and succeeds in bringing her back to you." Now, the whole court was in an uproar. "What do you mean, take the queen? You can't do that." Everyone heard the challenge, but nobody quite knew what to do. Then Kay approached the king and said, "I'm going to leave here forever." No one's able to persuade him to change his mind until Guinevere comes and kneels before him and refuses to rise until he grants her a request. Finally, Kay promises to remain if the king will grant his request. Guinevere and Kay approach Arthur and tell him about the deal they've reached, and tell the king that Kay must be given the opportunity to take up the other knight's challenge. Well, this is kind of not only, well, not kind of, that is really blackmail, but it's also dissing the queen. You know, here we've got this whole room full of knights, and the butler is going to go off with the queen and rescue her. But having given his word, the king has no option but to send the queen off with Kay, who promises to bring her back safe and sound. How many of you think that's going to happen? Guinevere says quietly, "Ugh, if you only knew, I'm sure you would never allow me to be taken away by this man." After the queen was led away, a great lament was made by all, as if the queen were already lying dead on her bier. That's B-I-E-R. Finally, Gawain said to his uncle Arthur, "Sire, you have done a very foolish thing. But if you will take my advice, you and I will ride after them while they're still nearby, and I will take anyone who wants to come with us. For myself, I cannot restrain myself. I'm going in pursuit of them at once." Arthur responded, "You've made a wise suggestion. This is not the Arthur that we have seen in the past." The king mounted, followed by Gawain and the others in quick succession. Some were armed, but many weren't, and he asked 2 squires to bring 2 extra steeds, led by their bridle. As the group approached the forest, they saw a horse running loose. Both rings of the bridle were broken, and the horse was running wild. The stirrups were all stained with blood, and the saddle was broken. They nudged each other and shook their heads. As they stood there, a knight came out of the woods on a horse that was sore, painfully tired and covered with sweat. The strange knight approached Gawain and said, "My horse is no longer serviceable. Might I have one or the other of the 2 extra horses you have, either as a loan or an outright gift?" Gawain said, "Take the one you prefer." The man in distress did not stop to choose the better, but leapt upon the one which was closest and rode off. The one he had been riding fell over dead. Gawain then went after him with speed until he reached the bottom of the hill. After he'd gone some distance, he found the horse, which he had given to the knight. The horse was dead, and he noticed that the ground had been trampled by many hooves. Broken shields and lances lay all about, so it seemed there had been a great combat between several knights, and he was sorry not to have been there. But he did not stay long, but passed on until he saw by chance the knight all alone and on foot. This knight had overtaken a cart. This is the sort of cart that was used for prisoners, somebody who has been accused of murder, adultery, robbery, whatever. And this was the cart in which that person was led through the town to the place where either they were going to get a trial or they were just going to get hanged. So it was disgraceful to mount up into the cart because everybody'd assume you'd done something bad. The knight called out to the dwarf driving the cart, "Tell me if you have seen my lady the queen pass by here," he asked. The dwarf said, "You get into the cart, tomorrow you'll learn what happened to the queen." And then he kept on going. The knight hesitated only for a couple of steps before getting in, but those couple of steps will count against him in the not too distant future. The knight felt shame getting into the cart, but the love in his heart bid him to mount at once. Gawain came up behind the cart. When he found the knight sitting in it, his surprise was great. "Tell me," he shouted to the dwarf, "do you know anything about the queen?" "If you want to know about the queen, you need to get up into the cart with this other knight, and I will drive both of you." Gawain said, "I consider this great foolishness. I will not get in, for it would be dishonorable to exchange a horse for a cart." They continued on into the late afternoon until they arrived at a town which was rich. Beautiful people were greatly amazed to see the knight on the cart and yelled at him in the street. They all wanted to know what his punishment was to be. Is he going to be hanged or drowned or burned? They didn't care what he'd done. They just wanted to know what people were going to do to him. "Tell us, what was his crime?" But the dwarf made no response. Gawain followed the dwarf to a tower where they were greeted by a damsel and her 2 maidens, all of whom were the fairest in the land. They asked the dwarf what the knight in the cart had been accused of, but the dwarf refused to answer and left. Soon a sumptuous feast was set. The damsel sat at the table beside Gawain, and here the knight would not have changed their lodging place for any other. The damsel showed them great honor and provided them with fair and pleasant company. Soon 2 high beds were prepared in the middle of the hall. There weren't any bedrooms back then. When people were ready to go to sleep, they brought pallets out or beds out, and people would go to sleep in the hall because That's where the fire was. That's where it was warm. There was another bed alongside the two with fur covers, more splendid than anything. It possessed all the excellence that one could think of in a bed. I just love that line. The lady said, "These two beds have been made for you. Do not even think about lying in the other one. It's not for you." And then she left. The knight who'd been riding in the cart said, "I'm going to sleep in that bed. It looks much more comfortable than the other two." And he lay down and went to sleep. But in the middle of the night, a lance came down out of the rafters with a pennant in flames at the top. It seemed intended to go through the knight's flanks and pin him to the bed. The tip of the lance passed so close to the knight's thigh that it pierced the skin without seriously wounding him. Then, calmly, he put out the fire, took the lance, swung it around the middle of the room, and tossed it without even leaving the bed. Then he lay down and slept again as serenely as he was during the first period. In the morning, the damsel of the tower had mass celebrated. Afterwards, Gawain and the lady were talking privately. While the knight who had been riding in the cart was apart from them, looking out the window below. People were carrying a bier upon which lay a knight. Alongside the bier, three damsels walked, mourning bitterly. Behind the bier, they saw a crowd approach with a tall knight in front, leading a fair lady by her horse's reins. The knight at the window knew that it was the queen. He watched till she was out of sight, and then he was tempted to throw himself out the window to the ground, way below. He would have done so had Gawain not seen him and drew him back inside the room, saying, "Please, never think again of committing such a mad deed. It's wrong for you to despise your life." But the damsel came in and said, "He's perfectly right in wanting to kill himself since he's been seen in the cart. He's lost his honor, and he'd be better off dead than alive. His life from here on out is going to be one of shame, vexation, and unhappiness." Sweetheart, isn't she? Then the knights asked for their armor, and they politely took their leave. They went off in the direction the crowd they'd seen, in the direction taken by the queen, but they did not succeed in overtaking the procession. Down the road, they met a damsel, and they greeted her and asked if she knew which way the queen had been taken. She said, "If you would pledge me your word, I could set you on the right road and path, and I would tell you the name of the country and of the knight who is conducting her. But whoever would try to enter that country will go through sore trials." Gawain spoke up and said, "Damsel, I put myself totally at your disposal. I promise you anything you desire if you please tell me where the queen is." She replied, "Malagant, a tall and powerful knight, son of the king of Gore, has taken her off into his kingdom. The kingdom hence no foreigner ever returns, but where he must remain in servitude and banishment forever." "Where is this country?" Gawain asked. "The kingdom is called Gore. The king is called Badamagu, and there are only two ways to enter. One is called the water bridge, and the same amount of water is above it as below it, and it's only about a foot wide. This is the least dangerous of the two, but even so, it's never been crossed by man. The other is just like a sharp sword, and therefore called the sword bridge. There are many other obstacles, but I'm not going to tell you about those. Please, damsel, tell us how to find the bridges. This path takes you to the water bridge, and this path takes you to the sword bridge." The knight offered Gawain the choice of bridges, and he chose the water bridge. As they started down their respective paths, the damsel said, "Remember, each of you owes me a favor of my own choosing whenever I may choose to ask for it. Take care not to forget that." Gawain and the knight parted company. A ways down the road, the knight is challenged by another knight guarding a bridge. I'm going to have to start chopping it a little bit here. So they fight and they fight and they fight and they fight. Later that day, he encounters another damsel who tells him that her house is ready for him, but her hospitality has conditions. He must agree to lie with her. Even though he is reluctant to agree, she forces him to do so. When they reach her home, every luxury is provided. Now, this next bit is quoted from Chrétien in translation to give you an idea of his prose. When they had risen from table, the damsel said to the knight, "Sire, if you do not object, go outside and amuse yourself, but please do not stay after you think I must be in bed. Feel no concern or embarrassment, for then you must come to me at once if you will keep the promise you have made." And he replies, "I will keep my word and will return when I think the time has come." Then he went out and stayed in the courtyard until he thought it was time to return. Going back into the hall, he sees nothing of her who would be his mistress, for she was not there. Not finding or seeing her, he said, "Well, wherever she may be, I shall look for her until I find her." He makes no delay in his search, being bound by the promise he'd made to her. Entering one of the rooms, he hears a damsel cry aloud, and it's, excuse me, the very one with whom he was about to lie. At the same time, he sees the door of another room standing open, and stepping toward it, he sees right before his eyes a knight who had thrown her down on the bed and was holding her naked and prostrate. Excuse me. She, thinking that he had come to help her, cried aloud, "Help, help, thou knight who art my guest. If thou dost not take this man away from me, I shall find no one to do so. If thou dost not succor me speedily, he will wrong me before thy eyes. Thou art the one to lie with me in accordance with thy promise. And shall this man by force accomplish his wish before thy very eyes? Gentle knight, exert thyself and make haste to bear me aid." He sees that the other man held the damsel brutally, uncovered, and he is ashamed and angered to see him assault her so. Yet it is not jealousy he feels, nor will he be made a cuckold by him. At the door there stood as guards 2 knights, completely armed with swords drawn. Behind them there stood 4 men-at-arms, each armed with an axe, the sort with which you could split a cow down the back as easily as a root of juniper. The knight hesitated at the door and thought, "God, what can I do? I'm engaged in no less than an affair. Questing the Queen Guinevere, I ought not to have the heart of a hare when for her sake I have engaged in such a quest. If cowardice puts its heart in me, and if I follow its dictates, I shall never attain what I seek. I am disgraced if I stand here. Indeed, I am ashamed even to have thought of holding back. My heart is very sad and oppressed. Now I am so ashamed and distressed that I would gladly die for having hesitated here so long. I say it not in pride, but may God have mercy on me if I do not prefer to die honorably rather than live a life of shame. If my path were unobstructed, and if these men gave me leave to pass through without restraint, what honor would I gain? Truly, in that case, the greatest coward alive would pass through. And all the while, I hear this poor creature calling for help constantly as he continues his mental dialogue, and reminding me of my promise and reproaching me with bitter taunts. Then he steps to the door, thrusting in his head and shoulders. Glancing up, he sees two swords descending. He pulls back, and the knights could not check their strokes. They had wielded them with such force that the sword struck the floor, and both were broken into pieces. When he sees that the swords are broken, he pays less attention to the axes, fearing and dreading them much less. Rushing in among them, he strikes first one guard in the sword side and then another. The two who are nearest to him he jostles and thrusts aside, throwing them both down flat. The third missed his stroke at them, but the fourth, who attacked him, strikes him so that he cuts his mantle and shirt and slices the white flesh on his shoulder so that the blood trickles down from the wound. It's almost like he was writing a movie script. Can't you just see the battle scene? But he, without delay and without complaining of his wound, presses on more rapidly until he strikes between the temples him who was assaulting his hostess. Before he departs, he will try to keep his pledge to her. He makes him stand up reluctantly. Meanwhile, he who had missed striking him comes at him as fast as he can, and raising his arm again, expects to split his head to the teeth with the axe. But the other, alert to defend himself, thrusts the knife toward him in such a way that he receives the axe just where the shoulder joins the neck, so that they are cleaved apart. Then the knight seizes the axe, wresting it quickly from him who holds it. Then he lets go the knight whom he still held and looks to his own defense, for the knights from the door and the three men with axes are all attacking him fiercely. So he leapt quickly between the bed and the wall and called to them, "Come on now, all of you. If there were 37 of you, you would all have the fight you wish. With me so favorably placed, I shall never be overcome by you." And the damsel, watching him, acclaimed, "By my eyes, you have no thought of that henceforth where I am." Then at once she dismisses the knights and the men-at-arms, who retire at once without delay or objection. And the damsel continues, "Sire, you have well defended me against the men of my own household. Come now, I'll lead you on." Hand in hand, they enter the hall, but he was not at all pleased and would willingly have dispensed with her. Okay. So here we are about 8 to 10% into the story. I'll give you a summary of the rest. And I know it's getting late. I can either give you the summary or you can see the preview of First Night. Which would you rather have? Rest of the story? On their way to the you can find a preview online. On their way to their respective bridges, each of the knights, the Knight of the Cart and Gawain, encounter fights, challenges, more beautiful women who apparently live by themselves in beautifully furnished homes with servants. And when each of the knights follows one of them home, he is tested sorely by battle or other attack. Not all the women are dangerous. On the way to Guinevere, Lancelot is aided by a number of beautiful women. and kindly girls. He encounters hostile and arrogant knights and must constantly defend his character. He and Gawain take different routes to Gore. Lancelot chooses the faster, more dangerous route of the sword bridge, which he crosses with difficulty, cutting his hands and feet deeply. The anonymous knight arrives in Gore to discover that Guinevere is angry with him for reasons she does not initially disclose. There, he also discovers that the ruler is the kindly and reasonable King Badamagu, who stands in stark contrast to his mischievous and sometimes vicious son, Meleagant. Rebuked by Guinevere, Lancelot, the heretofore anonymous knight, leaves to find Sir Gawain, who attempts to cross a different bridge and has not been seen since. While Lancelot is gone, Guinevere hears false rumors of his death and decides to show him warmth if he comes back. Lancelot returns to Badamagu's court, and Guinevere confesses that her coldness resulted from the hesitation he showed before leaping into the cart, those 2 to 3 fatal steps. Reunited, they share a passionate night together, but Lancelot's wounds from the cuts from crossing the bridge open up, and he bleeds on her sheets. The next morning, Meleagant sees the blood and accuses her of adultery. To defend her honor, Lancelot fights Meleagant. King Badamagu intercedes to end the battle, and Lancelot promises to fight Meleagant within a year's time at King Arthur's court. By this time, the people of Logres, King Arthur's people, are free to leave Gore. The first half of the narrative centers around Guinevere's imprisonment, while the second half is driven by Lancelot's imprisonment. Lancelot and his party set out to find Gawain, but Lancelot is tricked by a devious dwarf. Those dwarves, you just can't trust them. A henchman of Meleagant who takes him captive. A fake letter from Lancelot is sent to Guinevere insisting that she return to Arthur's court where she will find him. Meanwhile, Lancelot's party finds Gawain, who is also fooled by the letter. Returning home, they realize that Lancelot must have been captured. Meleagant soon arrives to demand his battle with Lancelot. Gawain promises to fight in Lancelot's stead, and they plan to fight within a year's time. In the meantime, a tournament is organized over which Guinevere is to preside. Lancelot hears about the tournament and convinces his jailer's wife to let him go long enough to go home, take part in the tournament, and then, on his honor, he will come back to jail. Guinevere, even though he's wearing unknown armor, recognizes him because of his strength and valor in battle. To test his identity, she sends a message that he should fight badly, and he complies. She then reverses the message and he triumphs, but then promptly disappears to return to his imprisonment as he'd promised he would do. Upon Lancelot's return, Meleagant imprisons him in an impossibly tall, impenetrable tower. When Meleagant's sister, for whom Lancelot had previously done a kindness, learns of the great knight's disappearance, she rescues him and helps him recover from his weakness. Lancelot then returns home at the moment when Gawain and Meleagant are to do battle. Lancelot steps in to vanquish the evil Meleagant, and the romance comes to a triumphant close. Perils of Pauline. So, very different from he fed ravens on the rampart, though he was no Arthur. We've come a long way, and this story has so many twists and turns that it was composed to be read, not to be heard like the earlier stories told by a bard. It might have been read by one person to a group of people, but the people listening would be able to say, I'm not, could you repeat that? Where are we now? I'm confused. In a way you can't do if you've got a bard telling you the story. You can't say, wait a minute. It also might have been read by an individual who was wealthy enough to own a copy of the manuscript. And here's your bit of trivia for the week. People back then did not read the way we do. They read aloud. Even if there were 3 or 4 people in a room reading, they would read aloud. Silent reading didn't come into play for another several centuries. I don't know why. I see your confusion. I'm confused, but there it is. When children are first learning to read, it's easier for them to read aloud. So these stories were designed to be read aloud, and that's why you will have noticed some repetition, because you have to keep reminding people, this is who it is, this is where we are, this is what's happened, and also all the details. You know, the color of the cloak, all that stuff. So have I got any questions? Oh, come on, all this bizarreness and there are no questions? Okay. Well, the movie that's coming up that you didn't get to see the preview of, which is First Night. And for those of you who like their movies bloody and battlefielded, this is the movie for you. If that's not your taste, don't come Saturday. The 2 following movies, the last 2 films, next to the last one is Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which has a lot of fake blood, fake injury, funny. So I don't really put it in the gory category, even though it is. And then the last film will be Camelot, the musical. Have a wonderful week. Stay well. And I look forward to seeing. No, because we ran over because I told the rest of the story. But you can find a preview online. Just